Pioneering hip-hop journalist, screenwriter, and showrunner, Cheo Hodari Coker literally wrote the book on Biggie, and then gave new life to Marvel's Luke Cage on Netflix. This is his blueprint.
Tell me about growing up in Connecticut. What was your first introduction to hip hop?
I was born in New Haven, Connecticut, but I grew up in Storrs, where the University of Connecticut is. And so I wasn't hearing any hip hop on WTIC. Everything was late. And also because I'm like one of the only, black kids in my school, I'm like anything that I'm searching for. I'm searching for myself. I'm trying to, figure out who it is I am. And my cousins, they lived in Montclair, New Jersey, so they were like taping like Red Alert and Mr. Magic off the radio. And then I would just like listen to the tapes, and I would just like to the point where they broke. I think what made me become a hip hop journalist was I was so searching for myself in the music that I held on to it tighter than most people who were just around it and like, oh yeah, I like this song, I like that song. For me, it was life or death.
Did your parents work in creative fields?
My mother was a lawyer, daughter of a Tuskegee Airman, and my grandfather was career military. My father grew up in New Haven, grew up in Hamlin Street Projects. My mom and dad split when I was really young. That kind of cultural schizophrenia of divorce in Connecticut, and the two Connecticut's. It's like, I'm with my dad in the projects and in his apartments, and he drinks a lot, and I'm going with him to bars and just kind of being around like relatively gritty stuff. And then I'm at my grandfather's with my mom, and he has a Porsche. And so when you grow up with that kind of confusion, you're like, well, who am I?
After high school, you go to Stanford. Mm-hmm. When you're applying, thinking about where you're going to go, did you have any sort of sense, like professional purpose?
You think that you want to be like a lawyer, particularly with my mom's background. But then I read my first law book, and I'm like, man, this is like reading a 1,000-page instruction booklet. And then all of a sudden, the first issue of The Source that I ever bought was the color Malcolm X cover. Reading that issue of The Source changed my mind about what I thought I wanted to do. And I think I was back in New York again over the summer. I went to SOB's, and KRS-One was performing. And I remember there was like this table, and it was like, I think, Chris Wilder, John Schechter, Rob Tilo, a lot of early members of what was considered the Source Mind Squad. And the fact that KRS-One, during the break in the set, goes and he's hanging out and shaking hands with these guys, I'm like, man, that's what I want to do. That's who I want to be. And then all of a sudden, it's just like you're in the Bay Area and you're around hip hop and you have the opportunity to write. So I started writing for the Bomb Hip Hop magazine, and I also started writing for Rap Pages. And then after a while, it was almost famous, where like I was living in a dorm and skipping classes, and then flying to Miami to interview Magic Mike for Rap Pages, or flying to LA to interview Ice Cube. And as far as the publications knew, I was grown living in the city. They didn't know they were sending records to my dorm room, and that was kind of the start of my career. I just all of a sudden got used to, talking and asking questions. And I think the most important lesson I learned from hip hop that I still apply to this day is be who you are. Don't try to be more or less than who you are, because rappers in particular, they just sniff through anything false. And then I think as a result, I got better interviews because people sensed the sincerity.
You were involved through no fault of your own in one of the sort of defining moments of hip hop journalism.
Yeah, Wu-Tang, yeah.
You had interviewed Wu-Tang Clan for Rap Pages.
Yep.
The Rap Pages editors commissioned a illustration.
For really, by Alika.
Okay, because they couldn't get a shoot, right? So what happens?
Anytime you're around Wu-Tang, it's controlled chaos. I wrote the piece for Rap Pages, and then because they didn't show up for photos, Alika does these illustrations based on the names. But they're kind of cartoon characters. So Raekwon the chef is now Raekwon in a chef's hat, roasting a pig, which of course, because he's 5% Nation, that's offensive. You God has an illustration where he's kind of elevated in the air. Old Dirty Bastard as a blow-up doll. It was just the kind of, it wasn't just the illustrations, it was the fact that the group wasn't really being taken seriously from their perspective. And so then everybody forgets about it, and then months later, I get my first piece for Mouth to Mouth. The piece was supposed to be Staten Island hip hop, and so I was catching up with Wu-Tang, and so I first run into Ghostface, and so we're sitting, we're talking, and one by one, members of the group end up showing up at the manager's house in Staten Island. I'm interviewing the group finally and talking to everybody. RZA, Jizza, and Master Killer pull up in a car. Master Killer gets out of the back, so I walk up to the car. Master Killer, you know, he comes up to me, he says, yo, you Cheo, right? And I'm like, well, yeah. That's just to let you know, Wu-Tang Clan nothing to fuck with. We no cartoon characters. We come real with our shit. My eye is like blazing. He has my tape recorder. I'm just reeling. I'm trying to figure out, can I save the interview? Because I'm the hip hop true believer. So how can I save the interview? I go into the house and Raekwon comes up to me and says, yo, Killer Snuff, do yo. You know, I'm just sitting down. I mean, this was like everyday thing for them. They fight all the time. So they all got in the minivan and just drove off to their show. And then the manager, he says, you know, what do you want to do? Like, you know, I said, look, I just want to replace my tape recorder. And so he says, all right. So then he pulls out this check. And I still have it, and you know, it's funny. I think it's a $65 check. And so by the time I catch a flight to get back to Stanford, I'm getting calls from all over the country. Like, one rumor was that it was Ghostface that hit me, not Master, because it was Ghostface Killer, Master Killer. People got confused. And then somebody said I got shot. And so it was all these rumors. And that's why I went public, because I had to kind of clear up what happened. Like, no, it was not Ghost, it was Master. And ultimately, all the notoriety is what finally led Anthony DeCurtis to say, hey, I read your clips. Do you want to write something for us for Rolling Stone? And that's how I ended up writing the record review for Ready to Die.
As your career starts to bloom, you make another very important connection in the hip hop community with Biggie and Puff. How did that relationship start? This
was 2 weeks after the first record dropped. So this was like, he still lives on 226 St. James. You know, I go there and we're talking, and it was crazy because, you know, every single car, you know, passing down the street was playing a different song from Ready to Die. And he's like right on his stoop. Trife and Larceny coming up to him and asking for a gun to go rob somebody, and him saying, I don't know what the gun is, and then saying, then as soon as they go, I know exactly where the gun is. You know, Big was. You can't judge Big by the photos, because he was so funny. The 3 different interviews I did with him, I got to just kind of know him and really ask him a lot of questions about his childhood and about his life. You know, the first one was, he was literally, the record just came out, he's still living on St. James. His whole fear in life was, I don't want to move out of Brooklyn and make a whack record. The Big that I hung out with 2 years later, with a cabana by the pool at the Four Seasons, is like, I can make a record anywhere. But then the last interview I had with Big was really the most introspective. That was after the Soul Train Awards, when we were in his hotel room, and he had a room service pizza balanced on his stomach. He had a big paunch, and he was sitting there, and he was eating, and we were talking. And that's when he talked about like wanting to give to give Tiana away at her wedding, wanting to be there for CJ, who was just born, you know, imagining a life where he was just kind of a suburban soccer dad. You never know the interview that's going to change your life. And so talking to Biggie changed my life, because, you know, if I hadn't have talked to Big that first time, and then also the last time, I wouldn't have written the Vibe cover story. I wouldn't have written, you know, the book Unbelievable: Life, Death, and Afterlife of Notorious B.I.G. I wouldn't have had the opportunity to co-write the movie Notorious. Co-writing the movie Notorious gave me the opportunity to become a television writer, to write Southland. And all those experiences in television ultimately led to me writing, creating, and executive producing Luke Cage.
Cheo's iconic interviews laid the groundwork that would propel his career. But gaining credibility in Hollywood proved even harder than in hip-hop.
In the late 90s, you penned these epic interviews with Big. How do you transition from that to getting involved in screenwriting in Hollywood?
there was so much competition between, even though we were all writing for all the different places, there was always so much competition and so much politics. Why am I gonna compete and get bitter over a $5,000 cover story when I could be making $150,000 selling a screenplay for roughly the same amount of effort? You get to a point where you're like, am I gonna spend my life writing articles about people pursuing their dreams, or am I eventually gonna pursue my own dreams myself? My uncle Richard Wesley, besides being, my greatest influence, my uncle, he, as a screenwriter, wrote Uptown Saturday Night.
Okay, so when you're growing up, you have these archetypes in your sort of immediate orbit to kind of show you the blueprint.
I was either going to be a fighter pilot or I was going to write movies. This is right around the time that Tupac gets killed. Connie Bruck wrote an article about Pac's death, and it was funny because my uncle, read that article. We both read it. We had two different interpretations. And that fictional conceit became the screenplay for Flow, which was kind of our hip hop version of The Godfather, about brotherhood and friendship, and things that kind of split apart, and the economics. I mean, it was Empire 20 years before Empire.
And so you're writing this in the late 90s?
Yeah, this was right around the time that, right after Big dies, right around the time I leave the LA Times. I lose this other writing opportunity. I went through a breakup, and I go back to Connecticut, and I didn't realize it at the time, but I was depressed. I said, wait a minute, let me look at myself. I'm watching television for 20 hours a day. I'm not really sleeping. Something's wrong with me. This is my last night of acting like this. I'm going to get up, and I'm going to will myself through the rest of the screenplay. We ended up selling to New Line Cinema because I was able to attach, since I knew John Singleton. John read it, he liked it, he attached himself, and we sold it. And then you do that, it sells in 1998, you get announced in Variety, you think, oh, this is how it is, it's easy. You're gonna sell a screenplay, and this is how. Flow still hasn't gotten made. Here it is, 20 years later, I'm talking about this thing.
What was the biggest challenge of tackling fiction from having, done nonfiction for 8-10 years professionally?
All a script is a document that allows 150 people to work together. And everybody looks differently at that document. But the thing about a good script is that when the script is good, for whatever reason, every department knows it, and they feel it, and they give their 150% because they believe in it. But what happens is you just kind of, after a while, you sell things, and they're not getting made, and you're just basically changing details because your development executive is getting bored. And then you get in this weird place where it's am I a professional writer? Am I selling screenplays every 2-3 years, enough to maybe get some health insurance or be able to, at a Hollywood party, respectfully call myself a writer? Yes, but is anything getting made? No.
How many years from, finishing that first screenplay until you were in a movie theater looking at your work?
It was 9 years, because between co-writing Flow and selling that, I wrote a few drafts of the Bob Marley story for Warner Brothers. Rich and I collaborated again on a script about Marion Barry's life for HBO that Jamie Foxx got attached to and was gonna make, and then he said, you know what? There's this movie I'm making in New Orleans about Ray Charles's life, that I'm gonna do that, and after I do Ray Charles, I promise I'm gonna come back and do Marion Barry. That didn't happen. One version of All Eyes on Me, I wrote Lowrider, which actually just came out, my first version of that. It wasn't really until Notorious gets made that all of a sudden, there's heat. The movie, to a certain extent, was ahead of its time. I think the thing about Notorious is that budget-wise and just the environment and certain things, it couldn't be as candid a look at Biggie's life. But because it was a serious look and because it was a well-made film, it opened the door for, these other biopics. I mean, really the best of which is, of course, Straight Outta Compton. I wrote the first 2 drafts of the script. Reggie Rock Bythewood rewrote the script. I probably wrote an unproducible movie, not from the standpoint of it wasn't well written, but because it was so big. Mm-hmm. And I think Reggie's approach was that he was able to navigate those waters that I now navigate all the time between studio and network, where the wants of the estate and also the wants of Fox Searchlight, but still make sure that he maintained the character.
The first part of your career in Hollywood, you're writing full screenplays, either with your uncle or by yourself. Then you move into TV with Southland. What is day one walking into a writer's room like?
It's scary. I look to my right, and John Wells is at the end of this long marble table over here. Chris Chulak is at the end of this table here. Diana Sohn is on the other side of the table, sitting next to Robin Green and Mitch Burgess, the Sopranos Emmy-winning team that eventually also created Blue Bloods. Everyone is more experienced than I am. And I'm like scared. And I'm like, how the hell did I get in here? Why am I in this room? And then I realized, okay, this is Southland. This is about cops. And I'm pretty much the only person in this room that has, had an experience like I had with the game, where it's like you're sitting in his living room and he's got an AK-47 on the ottoman and there's a police helicopter outside. Or having the experience of being in cars where you get pulled over, as opposed to just being on the other side, or being with the cops when you're doing a ride-along. Having that perspective gives me the opportunity to both write authentically about that side, in addition to hanging out with cops and understanding their perspective. And that's why Southland, I think, still, I love that show. At the same time, working with Ann again on Ray Donovan was great. What Ann taught me is emotional truth. Not only having your characters make sense and understanding what they wear and why those kinds of details are important. And also overall, what I learned from Ann as a showrunner is just every single detail, visual detail, music cue, it all matters.
So how does the Luke Cage opportunity present itself to you?
When Ann Bitterman left Ray Donovan after season 2, out of loyalty, when my superior left, I left, and I'm trying to figure out what's next. I wrote a pilot on spec with Q-Tip called Lyrics to Go, which was about the early years of A Tribe Called Quest. But then at the same time, I also started talking with Marvel because they were looking for somebody to do Luke Cage. And so I went in and I just talked about my passion for the character, and then also at the same time talked about the importance of heroes for African Americans, particularly African American males, knowing that having a black male superhero was the opportunity, because being a black male, writing about a black male, gives a certain perspective that I don't even think television really has, because when you have black men writing about black men, they write, it's a different kind of perspective. It was the perfect opportunity because 13 episodes were already greenlit. It wasn't about writing a pilot and then if everybody likes the pilot and then eventually comes out and people like it enough, we're gonna make 12 more episodes. It was already ready to go, just add water. What I pitched essentially was City of God meets Belly as written by the staff of The Wire.
Where does one even begin putting together the building blocks for this?
They gave me the scripts, the first 2 scripts for Jessica Jones, and the first 2, season 1, and the first 2 scripts of Daredevil season 1, because those were the Marvel television Netflix shows that were in production. I'm just completely floored. I'm completely intimidated reading this. I'm like, oh my God, how the fuck am I gonna compete with this? And that's what I realized, is that, wait a minute, which Luke Cage do I take? Do I take the Luke Cage that's alluded to in Alias? Or do I take the Luke Cage, the Sweet Christmas Luke Cage that everybody, with the tiara and the chain belt? And what I realized is that you could really do both, but just basically, instead of being afraid of the character's blaxploitation past, think about what blaxploitation really is. All blaxploitation is giving a black male character the agency to do things that white male characters take for granted. How do you modernize blaxploitation, but lose the misogyny, obviously, but at the same time having this forthright swagger? Like, how do you kind of have a character that has that, and then at the same time make it a comic book character? Marvel characters all have tragedy, or at the same time aren't happy to have their powers. Luke Cage is somebody who he'd rather not have his bulletproof skin, he'd rather not be strong in this way, he just wants to be a normal dude. And so the first step is writing the first 2 episodes, and then at the same time having some ideas about what's going to happen for the other 13.
Is that before you've assembled a writer's room? Like, do you go into your hole by yourself and knock out that pilot?
Well, you know what it is? Everything for me is music. And so I said, okay, let me take an old trick from, my hip hop journalism experience of like, how cover lines are constantly coming from song titles. So let me assemble different song titles and just from a simple thematic basis, think about like how Luke Cage and a story can kind of play off some of these interesting titles.
Did Luke Cage have an outsized budget in order to afford like this sort of over-the-top scoring and all of these music cues?
We just had to figure out how, with our budget, like being very selective with which songs we went after in terms of known songs for needle drops, then also from that allotted budget, okay, how are we going to use this money towards affording an orchestra? And the secret weapon beyond the acting and everything else was Adrian Young. I didn't know that Adrian was working with Ali Sheikh Mohammed, and so the fact that getting them both together, it was the perfect combination. And the way that they wanted to do the score was different, and them wanting to use an orchestra and just not anticipating how good the music. I mean, I knowing them, I knew that it was dope, but just what they did particularly for the show became like this fifth element. I take every lesson that I learned from hip hop and then I apply it to this job. So a perfect example is I DJ'd for a while. Watching the crowd move to a record, it teaches you things about the pulse that you can take with you everywhere. All those lessons, all that nervousness, it applies directly to a television show, because all of a sudden it's the same nervousness. It's like you have a concept, you hope that people dig it, and just saying, relax, you've done this before, you've seen this done, don't let the record drop. Like, you gotta figure it out. You gotta take that adrenaline and push it forward, always.
As Cheo navigated the terrain of having a hit show on Netflix, he came to embrace his power by channeling the swagger of his earliest hip-hop subjects.
There was a documentary on showrunning, and I think somebody says that it's one of the only jobs in Hollywood that has a 100% burnout rate. And I kind of view myself as the editor-in-chief of Luke Cage. So it's like the episodes have their own life. We plot them together, but then each individual writer not only is going to have their say in their episode, but they're also going to, since we did this in Los Angeles, they're going to come to New York and they're going to produce the episode. They're going to be on set for every take. They're going to interact with the actors and the director. At the same time, I'm back in LA getting notes, and we're getting notes from both Marvel and Netflix. And the thing about both those companies is that they're very particular, they're very smart, and they're very passionate. And that's kind of the hardest part of being a showrunner, is that sometimes you're going to be in a room and 40 people are going to tell you that you're wrong, and that you just have to say, this is what we're doing. But you better be fucking right. And just trying to figure out, okay, it's like, do I push it this time because I feel it's right? Because I trust the people that I work with? Am I gonna back off on certain things? Or, do you just kind of have to throw caution to the wind? And
what was an example of this in season 1?
Perfect example. It's like nigga doesn't exist in the Marvel universe in terms of like being a word that's used often. And so my thing was, in some of the scenarios in Luke Cage, particularly the street scenarios, it didn't seem realistic that the characters in these scenarios wouldn't use the word. In the pilot, the first episode, the moment with Mahershala Ali and Alfred Woodard in the balcony, when she's saying that she despises that word, and he says, like, he embraces the word because everybody underestimates a nigga. They never see you coming. I mean, to me, that's hip hop in a nutshell, because people, thought that the rappers that were calling themselves niggas were ignorant, but instead now they're captains of industry. And now they've not only flipped the word and the attitude on its ear, they also have basically created a culture and monetized that culture in a way that people, they have their own rules. And that's kind of the whole point of what Cottonmouth represents in the first place. And so it's always about taking these things here and there that you've experienced and that you've witnessed and just putting it into the art.
So you put out season 1 to essentially universal adulation, and it raises your profile personally, in addition to the show being very well received. How did your life change?
You know what it is? It's your life doesn't change. It isn't like all of a sudden people think that your ideas are any better. They listen a little more. It's more like it's being on the other side. It's like all of a sudden going from being a journalist quoting people to realizing that virtually every aspect of what you say is going to be quoted. Even something at Comic-Con, you're up there on stage and you have these bright lights and you're so nervous and you just try not to look, scared up there. And then so you just start talking off the top of your head and you say something like, the world is ready for a bulletproof black man. And then that quote just literally all of a sudden there's a Vanity Fair article about it and this is being bounced all over the place. And you've been saying variations of that thing over all the different interviews, but then when you say it in this one place, it just pings. You're gonna get hit with problems, you're gonna get hit with so much adversity at times, and you just have to kind of calm down and just give yourself the advice that I give my children all the time. I'm like, how do you eat an elephant? It's one bite at a time.
Do you have ambitions outside of show running? Like, is there a future in directing for you, or?
I think everybody says they want to direct, but I mean, directing is just like, it's a thankless job. I mean, writing on one hand, but directing is just like with the amount of hours and just, having to marshal a vision in a different way. It's like, it's a challenge I want to eventually take on, but it's one that I don't do lightly. I'd rather just kind of like lay in the cut and really absorb as many lessons as I can before taking on something like that. I'm kind of like, thinking about how Luke Cage, how he was reluctant to kind of come out of the shadows and eventually do what he did. I kind of feel the same way. I identify with that. I understand where that is. I know that eventually I'm gonna probably direct something, but I really want to just absorb as much as I can before doing that. The one thing I learned from watching the Bigs and the Puffies of the world, it's not what you know as much as it is, if you know something and you're confident in that something, just lead into it, and let the rest figure itself out. Like, it's not really what you think everybody else is gonna think is cool. Just do what you like, and hopefully you're right, and also be willing to live with failure as well, because you could be fucking wrong. And so you just have to live one way or the other, but you can't live in fear. That's the one thing you can't do.